This is a continuation on the previous video on how I prepare a wooden surface. Something that I learnt through dotting on multiple different surfaces is the more time I spend on preparation, the more consistent I can get with the dots. So I start off with a layer of homemade gesso, which I'll make another video on how I make that. And I will continue putting more coats on until I get to the point where I'm happy with that surface finish, which the reason I use gesso is basically to create a waterproof barrier between the wood and the final coat. Because of the clear coat I use, I find wood absorbs a lot of it, so it helps to stop the wood absorbing as much of the clear coat so that the clear coat stays on top and I don't end up using nearly as much clear coat. So then I'll run any form of, you can use spack filler or plaster filler, anything like that to smooth out a lot of the larger imperfections on the surface. This is the same thing that I do with canvas. I will use thicker gesso. I don't actually use plaster on the canvas, but I'll build up multiple layers of gesso on a canvas to get to the point where it's relatively smooth. You can buy some smoother canvases, but I've found I actually quite enjoy surface preparation. So the more I add layers of gesso and sand the high spots and basically fill in, I can get a canvas as smooth as wood if I take enough time with it. And so then I'll go through, obviously there's a lot of drying time in between each layer, and then I'll go through and it depends on how much I need to take off, whether I'll hand or machine sand. So plaster is obviously quicker just to use a random orbit sander. It's always handy when you can repurpose other tools like a car polisher and put a sanding pad on it. I prefer to do the edges by hand because it's a lot easier to not take too much off the sides by hand, whereas with the machine you can take a lot of material off really quickly. And so then I'll go back through adding more layers of gesso and taking notice of any high or low spots. Usually if there's heavy grain, these are just a couple of upcoming projects that I've got in the works for anyone who watches all of my videos. So here there was a knot in the wood here, so that's why I'm adding just a little bit of plaster in that spot. And also when I was first marking the center dot, there was two centers. One was slightly off, so I moved my starting point when I was cutting it. And so I was just filling that in so that I've got the right center dot. And then I'm going through sanding by hand with just a flexible sanding pad, but with it's actually a chunk of cork, just as a flat surface. So I've got the flexibility to take up, but also the solidness to keep it relatively flat. And as you can see, by the time I finished sanding, the plaster was dry enough to sand the whole piece. So you can just see the remnants of the knot in the wood there. And then, like I was mentioning at the start of the video, I want a pretty decent coat of gesso just for waterproofing purposes. And when you're sanding, you can really feel and see all of the highs and lows. And because I use either an airbrush or a spray gun to spray my base coats, it really highlights any of the imperfections. So the more time I spend on prep work, the better the base coat will lay down, because it'll be a smoother, more flat surface. And occasionally I have Shadow checking up on me, so she's always not far. I'm just wiping all the dust off, just so I can really get a good feel for how smooth the surface is. And you can see little bits of high spots where the timbers come through just a tiny bit, but that's not enough to bother me. And now I'm going on with a spray coat of primer filler, so that'll take out any of the really small stuff. So any of the lower spots, it'll start to fill them. So I'm basically treating the wood the way that I would treat a car, like preparing a car to paint. So the more I could smooth out a car, the better the finish on the car. And then just alternating directions so that it fills any of the cross spray. Then just a quick hand sand, just to take any of the overspray off and really see what the surface finish is coming out like. And then basically like a polish type finish with some wet and dry sandpaper. And it really depends on what I've put down, what I've sprayed, and also the finish depends on what grit sandpaper I will use for the wet and dry rub. And now I've decided to go with a black base. And then the next video will show the next layer that I put on and what I decide to do with the dot work. I hope you've enjoyed the video.